Hello. Thank you for coming to our event, Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and Anti-Arab Racism and the Israel-Palestine Conflict, a panel discussion. It is sponsored by Olympia BDS and Test Divest. And I guess a little bit of context, as most of you may know, the Olympia Food Co-op has decided to join the growing international movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel until they comply with international law and end its occupation of Palestine. It's always a great idea and important to host events on anti-racism in any community at any time, but it's particularly important considering what has been happening in our community since the boycott has taken place. Working in this kind of work, there's always charges or feelings of racism surrounding, particularly now, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And without going into too much detail about it, I'd like to introduce our speakers. I would like to thank Richard Lopez for playing the flute on our way in. He's with the Village Music, and he has some cards out there if you want to hire him to play some music. It's very beautiful meditation music, healing music. So our first speaker tonight will be Teresa Liba. Teresa Liba is a faculty of Third World Feminism and Middle East Studies at Evergreen and a former Fulbright scholar in Palestine. She writes and speaks fluently on Arab American experience and has co-edited 2 collections, Gender, Politics, and Islam, and Intersections, Gender, Nation, and Community in Arab Women's Novels, and works with both Arab American Community Coalition and the Rachel Corrie Foundation.
A few weeks ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my 11-year-old daughter, and she was telling me rather proudly about a story she was writing in which all her characters were Lebanese. And I found this kind of curious because, and I told her, I asked her, why did she make them specifically Lebanese instead of Arab, when I had always referred to us as Arab American? And she said, well, you know, Mom, when you say Arab, people's imaginations just go wild and they think of all kinds of bad things. And I thought, wow, at 11 years old, my daughter has learned the lesson of anti-Arab racism. Racism. It's a harsh word, and yet we need to name it. In his book, Privilege, Power, and Difference, Alan Johnson says that we must begin by the simplest act of naming systems of oppression out loud. Those are systems of racism, as well as other isms, anti-Semitism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, etc. And all these systems are built on power and privilege. He says that those of us who work for social change are often accused of being divisive when we draw attention to oppressive social systems. And moreover, he adds that every oppressive system feeds on silence. This is a good book on anti-Arab racism. If you're curious about it, by Steven Salaita. I put it up there just to say there is a growing amount of information out there. But basically, racism is about systems of power that dehumanize certain groups, that deny their civil and human rights, that say somehow they are unworthy of rights and security that those with privilege and power take for granted. Several scholars stated after 9/11, and even prior to that, that practically the only ethnic group about whom in the West racial slurs are tolerated or even encouraged are Arabs and Muslims. This is considered legitimate, a kind of respectable racism. Who are we talking about when we talk about Arabs? It's really hard for me to separate kind of Arab identity from Muslim identity and all the different categories. And I think in the United States that Arabs are defined often as the other of Jews. And so all of these identities are very much intertwined. But this is a map of the Arab world, and Arab usually refers to, in the United States, in this context, of people who have inhabited the Arab-speaking world. They can be descendants of 22 different Arab countries. There are significant numbers of Christians and Jews that are Arab in the Arab world, and there are about 4 million people of Arab ancestry in the United States. Prior to 1965, it was families like my Christian Lebanese family who immigrated in the 1920s that were allowed in, because Christians were seen as more assimilable than Muslims. So there were smaller numbers of Muslims. And also, if the Arabs were seen as having dark skin, they were seen as less assimilable. So the Civil Rights Struggle, the 1965 Immigration Act, allowed for more immigrants, more Muslim immigrants, more African Muslims, etc. In the Seattle area, there's about 65,000 Arabs, Arab Americans, and about 75% of them are Muslim. And I'm going to leave talking about Islam and the Islamic world, but 90% of Arabs in the world are Muslim, and so it's very difficult to separate Islamophobia, racism against Muslims, and the long history that traces back probably to the Crusades. But for Arab Americans, our identities are transnational, meaning that whenever there's a political conflict in the Middle East, we're usually kind of invisible in people's racial consciousness, but when there's a conflict in the Middle East, then we become sort of hyper-visible, like after 9/11. One strong example of the history of this is the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. And this is a cartoon that appeared, I guess, in 1976, but a typical sort of stereotype. And what is important to think about is how the images and the racist stereotypes coincide with US foreign policy. So it was in the mid-70s, after the 73 oil embargo, that Henry Kissinger made the brutally frank admission that oil is much too important a commodity to be left in the hands of the Arabs. Another striking thing about this image, if you think about, if any of you have seen like this, the images of Nazi images of Jews and the kind of image of Jews controlling the wealth, there's also a strong similarity to these images. Prior to 1967 was also kind of the turn, the 1967 war in US policy, and we saw a shift towards very negative images of Palestinians and the Palestinian terrorists. This is actually from, I think, the early 90s, because it mentions AIDS and the fall of communism and things like that. But this pervasive stereotype of the Palestinian terrorist has been effective in sort of saying that all Arabs are violent, all Palestinians are violent, and not only are they terrorists and fanatics, they shouldn't be admitted into the country, they also oppress their women violently, right? So this image captures another way in which racism, or what Edward Said has called Orientalism, is sort of used to say that they are fanatics that oppress their women, they keep them oppressed and veiled. And this is another sort of stereotype that has been used to justify, say, the wars in Afghanistan especially, that we're going in there to save women. There's a long history in the United States of racist policies against Arabs. But some of the most striking ones are, in 1986, the INS drew up a contingency plan. I'm going to go back to this image because I don't want you to look at Jerry Hall too long. Thanks. Anyway, they drew up a contingency plan it was under the Reagan administration that they would round up and all suspected terrorists of Middle Eastern countries in the event of war. And they even picked a place in Oakdale, Louisiana, where they would be detained. This plan was never carried out, but it became the theme of the film The Siege. In 1987, there was an arrest of the LA8, which was a Palestinian group who were just doing activist work and handing out flyers, and they were said to be supporting world communism and then terrorism. The government pursued their case for 20 years, and they used secret evidence to argue that immigrants do not have the rights of free political speech, especially if they're Palestinian activists, right? And in 1996, the Counterterrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act was passed by Clinton, and this preceded the Patriot Act, and it basically said that anyone who belongs to a terrorist organization could be held indefinitely without charge. And there were actually over 40 people held, and all of them were Arabs under the Clinton administration. And then, of course, we had 9/11 and a host of stereotypes with Osama bin Laden, and this New Yorker cover was satirizing the kind of virulent critique of Osama and Obama being somehow connected, and radical African American movements as well. But basically what happened under 9/11 is that the government expanded its powers, wiretapping, surveillance, searches, detention. There was a definition of material support for terrorism that could include broadly anything. There was a special registration program that any non-immigrants, even though there were almost 4 million people living in the US that were out of status, there were 80,000 Middle Eastern people who were required to register, and 13,500 were ordered deported. The government didn't end up deporting all of them, but about 5,000 Arabs and Muslims have been detained, and many of them deported post 9/11. This was the largest historical roundup except for Operation Wetback in the 1950s. Extraordinary renditions, we've heard about. The end point of this is the kind of explicit torture policies that are coming out again under the WikiLeaks recently, that the US government knowingly turned over people for torture. So once you dehumanize a group of people, this is what becomes possible. And despite all these policies, Arabs are still classified as white, non-European in our country. And even though activist groups have tried many times to be counted as Arabs to gain political power, what we found after 9/11 was that the Census Bureau was turning over tabulations and statistics about Arab Americans to the Department of Homeland Security from the ethnicity question on the census. And there were proposals to plan and map Muslim neighborhoods in the name of security. So one of my friends who works with the Arab American Community Coalition and has been working against detentions of Arabs and Muslims, probably there's been about 200 deported in the Seattle area, he estimates, said that we're not literally in internment camps, but we're in virtual camps. Because these policies of surveillance and technologies are so advanced that they don't really need to round us up. They just monitor our communities, and everybody knows, and the FBI makes visits, and people are intimidated and scared. What happens is that this anti-Arab racism, and it's hard to separate again from Islamophobia, it gets exploited so that people identify more with Israel as victims than they do with Arabs, because they're not quite human. A really powerful example of this is when Madeleine Albright, in the mid-90s, she was questioned on 60 Minutes. And at that time, there were 5,000 Iraqi children dying every month from the sanctions. And Leslie Stahl asked her, you know, why this was happening, and UN officials had said that this was a genocidal policy. And Madeleine Albright said, it's difficult, but we think the price is worth it. It's hard to imagine. You know, she didn't lose her job, right? She stayed Secretary of State. Hard to imagine her saying that about some other group of children, that 5,000 dying every month is a price that's worth it. So in terms of Israel and Palestine, I could say personally that I certainly felt my Arabness in different ways, in new ways, unexperienced ways when I went to Israel. One of those was had never been strip searched at the airport before. That was a new experience. The other was that every time I passed through a checkpoint and they looked at my passport and they saw my Arab name, they would say, "What's your father's first name?" And it took me a while to figure out why they were doing this. They're trying to figure out which are the Muslims and which are the Christians. And my father's first name is Ronald, so I got a pass. They also probably don't know Arabic very well because Saliba means cross or Christian, so. But this is nothing. These are small things, and it's nothing compared to what Palestinians experience. So if we think about racism in terms of power and privilege, it's important to remember that this is the fifth or fourth largest military in the world against an unarmed civilian population. Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed from their homes have been demolished, their farmlands, their olive groves. They're enclosed behind prison-like walls in the name of national security. There's a network of checkpoints. Guns are pointed at them everywhere they walk, not to mention the discrimination that Israeli Palestinians face. And what do we call this? Some people call it a benign occupation, others national oppression. Still others call it racism or apartheid. In the discussion of Palestine, I see a lot of denial around the term racism and the treatment of Palestinians. And I think this is a variation on what Edward Said termed the denial of Palestinians' victim status, because they are victims of the victims. They are victims of the Jews who are victims of the Holocaust. But for those who accept this kind of thing, and this is graffiti on a wall in Hebron. For those who accept this as the fate of Palestinians, I would ask, how many of you would be willing to give up your privilege to live like that? For me, one of the most insidious ways that this power plays out is the repeated silencing of the Palestinian story. When I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, I was told flat out by my advisor that if you include a chapter on Palestinian women in your dissertation, you will have a very hard time getting an academic job, okay? And this is common, and we know it's true not only for Arab scholars, but Jewish scholars as well, and other scholars who choose to write on Palestine. And this is part of the power to control the discourse. And this silencing I have seen happen here in our community. If we bear witness to Palestinian suffering, if we work to end the occupation, we're told we're anti-Semitic or divisive. We are extremists, as Palestinians and Arabs are stereotyped often as extremists. We're extremists to mention the rights guaranteed to Palestinians under international law. Still, whenever we counter anti-Semitism, we need to name it, and we need to confront it. But for me as an Arab American, this conflict is not primarily an issue of identity or of Arab versus Jew. In 1982, I was a young undergraduate at Berkeley, and Israel had just invaded Lebanon and killed 17,000 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. And I was drawn into this issue by a Jewish graduate student who approached me and said, "Hey, you're Arab, you should care about this issue." And he turned me on to Edward Said, and I've been reading him ever since. When I traveled and worked in Israel-Palestine in the 1990s, I could identify both with the Palestinians because they shared the culture, language, and foods of my Lebanese immigrant family. But I also, as an American with relative privilege, identified with Israeli Jewish activists, the lawyers whose offices were filled with Palestinian clients, the human rights activists who were committed to documenting government and military abuses and were using their privileges to struggle for Palestinian human rights and self-determination. And I was inspired by them to believe that it's possible for all of us to create a common future, and for them to create a common future that affirms life, justice, dignity, and security for all peoples. Thank you.
And I'd like to mention that earlier today, Martin Friedman led an anti-racist workshop at Evergreen that I attended. It was really good, along with Dustin Washington. All right, and he's it was with the People's Institute. Martin Friedman is an Evergreen grad in 1988 and loves the opportunity to come back any chance he gets. He is an organizer and trainer with the People's Institute Northwest and has done extensive work on the intersection of Jewishness and racial identity, including 2 talks in Brooklyn.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm gonna try that again. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. I'm a little different. I just need to hear you guys. I need to know you're out there a little bit. One thing is very clear listening to Therese, and she laid out stuff amazingly. One thing is very clear, I am not an academic. I come to you as an organizer. The knowledge that I have around Jewish identity, the knowledge I have around how I've learned that it intersects with racism, how I've learned that anti-Semitism intersects with Jewish racial identity and with oppression, anti-Jewish oppression. I've learned all of this in the context of being an organizer, a community organizer. The information that I have is information that I hope leads to liberation. One of the things that I've been reading a lot over the last couple of weeks to try to pretend to be an academic. So we'll see how I do. I studied acting when I was at Evergreen, so let's see if I can at least act like an academic. And one of the things that I read is that we often say anti-oppression, but what happens if we were to say liberation instead of anti-oppression, right? Because really anti-oppression is about, if we're anti-oppression, we're pro-liberation. So the information that I have that I want to try to share with you tonight is information that I feel helps liberate me as an individual and hopefully will help liberate us as a collective as we struggle through very, very difficult conversations. And I want to acknowledge early that this is a very difficult conversation for a lot of us to have. For me, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I was raised in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. I was born in University Heights, Ohio, which at the time in 1963 when I was born was all Jewish and all white, essentially, all white Jews. All Jews of European descent, all Ashkenazi Jews. My family intentionally moved us when I'm the youngest, and when I was a little more than a year, 14 months old, they moved us to Shaker Heights, Ohio, which at the time was the largest city of its type in the United States to purposely integrate. So they wanted me to grow up in a diverse place. So I want to give honor to my parents because my parents sent me on a journey that would have been really different had I been raised in University Heights instead of Shaker Heights. It also put me in a place that was precarious at times between multiple identities. I would say that I didn't even really personally have a white first identity until I was probably about 9 or 10 or 11 years old. I went to Hebrew school and 4 times a week from the time I was 5 years old. And because of where I was raised, I hung out with a lot of black kids because that's who was on my block. So early on, I kind of had these issues around getting pressure from the black kids because I got Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off and they didn't. Getting pressure from the Jewish kids because they said I talked with a quote-unquote black accent. So early in my life, and when I say pressure, I mean we had to fight sometimes over that stuff, you know? And early on in my life, I realized that I was going to have to go through life with multiple identities, that having just one clear identity was not, it just wasn't going to happen. And I want to say that, that as I got older, I got whiter. By the time I was an adult, I was purely white. I will always be Jewish. I will always be a Jew, but I was a white Jew. Whereas when I was younger, I might call myself a Jewish white. You know, and it might sound kind of funny or like a little picky thing, but it's not. The analysis that I operate out of is an analysis of race and racism, and what is the intent of having race. Why do we have race? There didn't used to be race. There wasn't race in the Bible. I'm sure we have people that know the Bible, the Quran in this room, and you never see black or white or Asian or Latino or Hispanic. You never see that, right? Has anybody ever seen race in the Bible? Not description, not nationality, not tribe, but race, like black or white. This is a made-up construct. This is a construct, a human-made construct that doesn't even come about until the 16 and 1700s. And the purpose of creating the idea of races out of cultural anthropology is to put white as the model of humanity and the height of human achievement. And for the purpose of establishing and maintaining privilege and power. That's why race was created. And in the beginning, when white was first created in this country, it was created also to keep poor people of color apart. So you had poor people of color in this country, and you had poor whites who were outliving their indentured servitude in this country. And white was created to keep those people from coming together and being a powerful entity. Race was created. Race codes, black codes, slave codes, all these different things over history were created to lift one group of people up by giving a racial identity called white and keep other groups of people down who hadn't achieved that racial identity. White is a status. White is access. White is access to power, okay? Now, you're probably saying, why the hell is this guy talking about this stuff? He's supposed to be talking about anti-Semitism. I don't think that you can have the conversation about anti-Semitism in this country without talking about the racial identity of Jews. When we say Jewish, we usually are thinking of a person of European descent. Is that correct for people in the room? When you hear the word Jewish or a Jew, when you hear a Jew, what do you usually think of? Generally a person with European features? Okay. What's that? Okay. All right. Generally, and you know, if you go a little deeper and if you know a little bit about Jewish identity, you also know that there's types of Jews. There's Ashkenazi Jews who are of European descent, and there's Sephardic Jews who are from Spain and Portugal and France and other areas now called the Middle East. And then there's Mizrahim Jews, which is the latest racial category given, which is more African Jews or Jews that stayed in that area, right? So you learn that as you get deeper, but for most of us, when we think of Jewish, we put an identity of white to it. And when we talk about Jews and Arabs, when we talk about Jews and blacks, those two talks I gave in Brooklyn were about blacks and Jews, right? Well, that's saying that's assuming that there are no black Jews, right? To say, let's talk about the issues between Arabs and Jews is saying that there's no Arabic Jews or Jews of Arab descent or Sephardic Jews. Right? So I don't think we can have this conversation without also talking about race and without also talking about white. Even defining, I have more questions than answers. I'm sorry, but I do. Even what a Jew is often leads to more questions than answers. Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a religion? Is it a culture? Is it all of the above? I prefer to look at it mostly as an ethnicity, because the way that the ethnicity has been defined for me that makes the most sense is that it's something that travels with you where you go, that it has elements of nationality to it. An Italian living in Italy is Italian. Italian living in Olympia, Washington is an Italian American. Still Italian, but no longer his nationality, now his ethnicity. It traveled with him, right? Jewish travels with you where you go in this world. I taught English in Budapest, Hungary about 20 years ago. And one of the classes I had, they asked me, was I Hungarian? I said, yeah, I'm Hungarian. I'm a quarter Hungarian. Both of my great-grandparents were born in Budapest. I was all excited. Same district I live in. I was so excited. And they were all excited. Oh, he's a quarter Hungarian. How exciting, right? Well, a couple weeks later, one of my students asked me, are you Jewish? I don't know why it came up. Some I said, whatever. And I said, yeah, I'm Jewish. And they said, well, you lied to us. I said, what do you mean I lied to you? You said you were a Hungarian. And I said, I am a quarter Hungarian. No, you're not. Your ancestors were Jews that lived in Hungary. You are not Hungarian. They were not Hungarian, and you're not Hungarian. This was an early lesson to me about the fact that Jewish is something that will travel with you where you go. The question comes up, do you have to be observant of Jewish law to be Jewish? Well, a lot of people will say yes to that, but my experience is that no matter what you observe, Jewish will travel with you where you go. You know, nobody asked me what I believed in when they said that. When you start looking at what anti-Semitism is, first let's look at the word a little bit. The word anti-Semite, first let's look at the word Semite or Semitic, right? So the word Semitic, as I understand it, there's a couple different definitions, but the one that seems to be the most prominent is being descendant of Shem, who was the son of Noah. So a descendant of, so it was originally Shemite. It was originally Shemite, meaning you were descendant of Shem. But descendants of Shem also include people of Arab countries, right? So it's not just Jews, but it's anybody from the so-called Middle East or from any of those countries. So it could be Israeli, it could be Arabic, it could be a lot of different people are Semites, right? Now, so why is it Semitic? In doing this kind of work that I've been doing, sometimes people say, you know, well, this is a way of Jews owning an oppression. And, you know, so I did a little research into that because that kind of made a little sense to me. You know, maybe we've been trying to own this oppression the same way that Jews of European descent have kind of come to own the term Jew, even though 2/3 of the Jews in this world would not be considered white if they were sitting in this room right now. 66% of all Jews in the world are people of color. So I investigated a little bit, and actually it's a German word, and it was. I have the actual things here because I'm very, very academic. The gentleman's name was Wilhelm Marr, and he coined the word anti-Semitismus in the book. Yeah, really academic. And the book was called The Way to Victory of Germanicism over Judaism. It was in 1879, and Marr used the term as a pseudo-scientific synonym for Jew hatred or Judenhass. Basically, Herr Marr was trying to look more intelligent than he really was. And Judenhass was something that the lower class people said. So he wanted something that sounded a little bit more, fancy. So he came up with anti-Semitism or anti-Semitismus, and created the League of Anti-Semites, Anti-Semiten Liga, the first German organization committed specifically to combating the alleged threat to Germany posed by the Jews and advocating their forced removal from the country. Remember, this was 1879, so it's a long time ago, a long time before the European Holocaust. So the term was put on Jewish people, right? It was put on Jewish people in the reality of what it was to be a German in the late 19th century, what it was to be a Jew in late 19th century Germany or Austro-Hungary. That's how the term was put on. So whether or not it's an inclusive or exclusive term right now, the fact is it's a term that we've been wearing for a long time, right? Now, a lot of people will say anti-Jewish oppression instead of anti-Semitism, okay? More questions than answers when it comes to anti-Jewish oppression. Again, we have to first define what do you mean by Jewish? Does anti-Jewish oppression include oppression of Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews and the Jews of Sudan and the Jews that still live in India and the Jews that live in China and the South American Jews? Or is anti-Jewish oppression more something that we connect with Jews of European descent, Ashkenazi Jews, okay? Then the other question that I have, which is probably just a tad bit more controversial, is how do we define oppression? What does it mean to be oppressed? And is there a difference between pain and hurt feelings and oppression? And it's a hard question. I mean, again, I have more questions than answers because to me, I was called a Christ killer when I was a kid. And that was painful. That was painful. But, and again, remember, I was more Jewish than white when I was younger too. I had a way out of it. I had a way out of being a Christ killer, and my way out of being a Christ killer in the United States, and I probably shouldn't keep saying that over and over, especially because, can you please cut this part out of the video? The way out of being called a Christ killer is to become more white than Jewish. And in this country, we have the option to do it. And we cannot talk about issues between Ashkenazi Jews and Arabs without being able to talk about the fact that if you're of European descent and Jewish in this country, you can be perceived and you will get privileges from being white. And this opens a whole can of worms. So now we're saying, yes, there's a type of oppression that we're connected to, but we're also saying at the same time that we're connected to privilege, unearned skin privilege, because we can pass and be perceived as white. There was a court case. I won't go too deep into it, but there were 2 court cases I want to talk about that were people suing to be naturalized citizens in this country. One court case was the case of Bhagat Thind, who was from the Punjab region of India. And Bhagat Thind said, people from India should be naturalized citizens. In order to be a naturalized citizen, starting in 1790, you had to be free, white, and of good moral character. And in order to be seen as white, you had to be scientifically Caucasoid. And he said, people from the Punjab region of India were born on the Caucasus Mountains, therefore were scientifically Caucasoid. Therefore, we should be white, and the court agreed with him. And everybody from India that was living in the United States at the time, I believe it was only about 60 or 70 people, became... Oh, I didn't mean to make a joke, but I mean, they applied for, 60 or 70 people applied for citizenship, is what I should say. There was probably a lot more people from India, but 60 or 70 people from India actually applied for citizenship and became naturalized citizens. About a year and a half later, the Supreme Court looked at the case and they said, you know what? We don't want to go on this science anymore. Caucasoid, schmackazoid, we're not feeling that anymore. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go by something called the perception of common man, or the idea of common perception. So now, instead of giving you a scientific classification, we want to know, can Bhagat Thind from the Punjab region of India, can he commonly be perceived as white in early 20th century America? And the answer was no, he could not be. Therefore, he lost his naturalized citizenship, and every person from India who had become a naturalized citizen lost their citizenship, okay? But the real point of it is now that says all I have to do to be white and to be a naturalized citizen, all I have to do is be able to be commonly be perceived as white. That's, that opens up the whole door for people that are not white at the time. There are so many Europeans who were not white in the early 1900s, including Eastern European Jews, like all my ancestors. My ancestors were all here then, and none of them were legally seen as white. None of them. They did not have white privilege. They were not seen as white. Italians were not seen as white. Greeks were not seen as white. But after Bhagat Thind, what's that? Somebody says.
In Australia, they were the same thing.
Yeah.
I was called War, Italian and Greek.
That's
all
right.
3 at the same time.
That's right. So it's that identity that stays with you no matter where you are, right? It stays with you where you go. But what the Bhagat Thind decision does here is it says all I have to do is be commonly, I don't have to have a civil rights movement. I don't have to be hosed down by fire hoses and have dogs sicked on me and killed. All I have to do is commonly be perceived as white. Now, how do my ancestors, the Cohens and the Friedmans, how do the Cohens and the Friedmans go about in the courts? And oh my gosh, my grandmother, she's rolling over right now because I can't think of her name. But anyways, those ancestors of mine, I'll have bad dreams tonight. How do they go about being white? They go about being white by denying their Eastern European Jewishness. They go about being white by forbidding Yiddish to be spoken in the home, so they speak only Yiddish, but they don't allow their children to speak Yiddish in their home. They go about becoming white by changing the way they dress, changing the way they practice the religion, by losing a lot of things that define who they are. That's how they go about being white. They could never be white. They died not white. But by my parents' generation, my parents were white. They became white in their lifetime, essentially. And I was born with the ability to be white, okay? So that is a huge difference when we're having any kind of conversation about what anti-Jewish oppression means. Because if you are going to oppress me as a Jew, you're going to have to get through my white privilege. And if you oppress me as a Jew, I might just use my white privilege to get back at you. And if you think about, again, what is oppression? If you look at some of the things that happen to people that speak out against Jews in this country. Now, I don't believe that the things that happen to them are because Jews control the world. I don't believe that Jews control banking, and I don't believe that Jews control the world. But what I do think happens is I think that we are so intent and intense about not wanting to be oppressed anymore that we'll use any tool that we have. And in this country, one of the tools that we have is access to privilege and power. We have access to power because of our ability to be white. And if we put ourselves as Jewish first and not white first, we lose a little bit of that privilege. And I want to give you an example of it, the example of Crown Heights. Everybody familiar with Crown Heights in Brooklyn? So there was a Rebbe there, a Hasidic Rebbe in the 60s. There were a lot of Jews were living there. And then in the 60s in New York, everything changes. You know, the 40s, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Jews and blacks were like very closely aligned. They were played basketball together. They were in gangs together. They hung together. And the biggest issues they both had were with Irish and Italians, with Catholics, right? In the 60s, that starts to change because Jews become whiter and whiter. And by the 60s, there becomes white flight out of Brooklyn. So all the Jews are leaving Brooklyn. But the Rebbe, he pulls all his congregation together and he says, we're not leaving. And he quoted some biblical scripture for why you shouldn't leave, why it was against God's will to leave. And he said, we're staying. And the decision to stay did two things that might seemingly be oppositional. One, it made those Jews less white and gave them less access to privilege. But the other thing that did is it allowed, they were the only people of European descent left in that neighborhood, so it also made them more white to the people living there, right? But remember, everybody else left but them. So in the eyes of institutions and systems, which is where we really find racism, which is really what I mean when I say, if you mess with me as a Jew, you better be careful because I can access these systems and institutions. What happened was when Crown Heights had a riot because somebody in the Rebbe's cars, you know, whatever you call those things, where a lot of cars are together, one of them ran over a young African-American boy, and there were riots afterwards where a Jewish man from the temple was killed, from that same shul, from that same sect of Hasidism. He was killed after, and this is where it's interesting though. The police surround Crown Heights. And does anybody know how long that riot went on for? Anybody know?
4 or 5 days.
Yeah, 4 or 5 days. A solid 3 days. Now, I say that you put yourself Jewish first in this country, and you're going to lose some of that privilege. Anybody that knows New York, let's say that if that had been the Upper East Side, and that the Jews that lived on the Upper East Side were in some kind of a conflict with people from Harlem, how long would that last? Maybe an hour? Maybe 2 hours? But they're not going to surround the area and let it happen because when that system, when the criminal justice system and the system of the fire and the ambulances, when they looked at what was going on there, they saw people that had really forsaken their privilege in a lot of ways by making that decision to stay. It's probably time now, huh? Yeah. All right. See, I end up going over. All right. Well, I have more to say, but hopefully we'll get to. There's a really good slide. One slide I want to show you later, but yeah, hopefully we'll get to more stuff in the questions. But thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Right. Our next speaker is Jeff Siddiqui. He'll be speaking on Islamophobia. Jeff Siddiqui is a spokesperson for American Muslims of the Puget Sound and has worked with a variety of organizations in the Northwest to dispel common myths about Islam and Muslims. And he told me to tell you that he loves challenging questions.
Islamophobia is a new word. Most people haven't heard it for long. But Islamophobia is a very, very, very old concept. It's a concept that predates Islam. Because in those days, it was a phobia against something else. Everywhere, it is a phobia. It is a fear of something or somebody that galvanizes people, brings people together, And then when that one threat, if I may call it communism, call it blacks, call it Irish, goes past, they just peel off that label and stick another label on it, and this latest label happens to be Islamophobia. What we live on is fear. That's the basic bottom line. That's the label we're all looking for. It's the oldest method of control. It's as old as humankind itself. We use it everywhere. We use it to quiet the children. Be quiet or the bogeyman will come and get you. We use it in religion. Be good or you'll burn in hell. Now that's fear. We use it in politics. Just now, the Republicans are getting a majority because of the fear of economic catastrophe. Fear is what is doing it. We have the fear. We have to have a fear of the other, and we have to invoke it as the other that will come and destroy us. That rallies people together. Oh my God! Here, take my liberties, take my power, take everything I've got. Just keep me safe. And the people in control say, yeah, we'll keep you safe, keep me in power, and I'm the savior. Here, you should be afraid of the Muslim hordes who are coming to get us. And did I mention I can protect you? The savior. But even the savior, when he comes into power, doesn't say, I've cured it. Because as soon as you cure it, he's out of a job. So there's always more. There's a bigger threat than we thought before. Al-Qaeda wasn't just a few dozen or a few hundred people hiding in caves that we blew to smithereens. Now it's everywhere. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the peninsula, Al-Qaeda here, Al-Qaeda there. My God, everywhere. It sounds like old MacDonald's thing. Because we have to have Al-Qaeda. If we didn't have Al-Qaeda and the Muslim threat, Islamic threat, our politicians and our country wouldn't know what to do. Fear brings people to power. Fear takes people away from power. Fear is also the shortest way to fame and fortune. Today, if I say, I really denounce Islam, Quran is nothing but a violent version of Mein Kampf, and people have to rewrite Islam and they have to reinvent Islam, I'll be rich before the end of the year. I'll be on speech circuits, I'll be everywhere, and it's a tempting thought. And truth is the first victim of this kind of a phobia. The Catholics drink human blood and human flesh. Jews grind up children to leaven their bread. Muslims have all these other things. They're terrorists. Their Quran forces them to go and kill people. We hate the way everyone else lives. And so we create these things. If you repeat them enough times, then they become fact. So truth is your first victim. And unfortunately, silence provides the smooth road for the oppressors and the bigots to drive on. And silence is the bedrock on which extremism and phobias and manias thrive. Hitler wouldn't have lasted 2 weeks if Germans, good Germans, and there were lots of good Germans, had spoken up. Same here. King George I wouldn't have lasted more than a few days if he had come out with his Islamophobia and people had actually spoken up. But speaking up requires more than just the act of saying something. It requires a certain amount of gumption and guts, and unfortunately we like the way we are. We don't want to move it. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was actual panic in the high reaches of power. People were saying, my God, Soviet Union is now gone. At first, our politicians said, no. Soviet Union is not yet gone. Yes, communism seems to have collapsed, but it's a false alarm. It's not gone. And they were trying to look desperately to find what other place to cause a fear. The woman who was the head of MI5 at that time, I forget her name. She made a great speech. She said, now we're going to have to develop another enemy, and Islam is our most obvious next enemy. And it just took off from there. The world just had to find the enemy. And as they were looking, the crosshairs landed on us chickens right here. And that was it. Today, Muslims are the easiest target for any kind of oppression and for the fear industry. The easiest target. There are no negative consequences for people who target Muslims. We have no political profile. We have no political bedrock. Our people, Muslims in America, are not politically active or engaged enough to be significant, to be counted. And in this country, as in any other country, if you don't have a political profile, if you don't have a political identity, if you're not engaged, you don't exist. And if you don't exist, eradication is a very simple way. Nobody's going to miss you. If you go back to the time when the Japanese were put in concentration camps in the West Coast, they weren't internment camps as we've learned to talk about them. They were concentration camps. As they were put in, why were Japanese selected for it? Why not Germans? A, of course, the Germans looked white. But B, the Japanese always maintained a very low profile. They had no political profile at all. They thought if we stay down, nobody will look at us. Nobody will look for us. Well, they were wrong. Because in times of stress, in times of when a society is under stress, they need a scapegoat. And it ain't going to be the most powerful, privileged group who's going to be the scapegoat. It's going to be the non-existent group. The Native Americans, the blacks, the Catholics when they were very few in number, the Jews, the Japanese, Chinese, and Muslims. Forgive me if I've missed anyone. Who wins? Who wins when Islam and Muslims are targeted, and why? And there are some very, very interesting interest groups that win. The first are the right-wing churches. The right-wing churches have an obsessive fear of Islam. They are so keen on bringing Christianity to the whole world, and they have had this adversarial relationship with Islam for so long that they can't see beyond it. Plus, they also want to see all Jews going back to Israel according to the Bible, where they'll then convert, and those that don't convert get destroyed, and Judgment Day will come. And Muslims are just an impediment. Get the Muslims out of Israel and bring the Jews in, so the right-wing churches. We have the right-wing Jewish groups, right-wing synagogues. They have the fear of annihilation, which is actually not a misplaced fear. It is a very, very valid fear when for centuries Jews have been the most obvious target. Again, they had no political profile. They were always dispossessed, always in another country. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they didn't exist. They didn't have rights. So whenever there was some kind of an uprising or a problem, let's go get the Jews. Pogrom after pogrom after pogrom, then came the Shoah. And my God, that was what, half the Jewish population on earth was wiped out? So it's not irrational, it's a very rational fear. But even fears can have irrational consequences. And this fear of annihilation, when it is looked upon, when this is pasted onto the state of Israel as the only salvation Jews have, and then that morphs into, well, Israel has to be protected no matter what. It's the no matter what that starts causing problems. And then that becomes anybody who opposes the state of Israel is actually planning to annihilate or supporting the annihilation of Jews. And therefore, it is my right and my duty and my life's pursuit as a Jew to go and oppose these people, exterminate them if I have to, because I'm protecting the only sanctuary we've got. So that it's a very twisted logic. But just because it's twisted doesn't mean it's not logic and it's not real. For those people, it's 100% real. So they have a very strong dog in the fight here to support Islamophobia, because when you demonize Muslims, by inference Palestinians, who's counting the Christian Palestinians, then it makes it easier to dispossess and commit any kind of act against them, and it makes it more palatable. The third group is the politicians. The politicians see this whole potential source of money and votes. The right-wing people, Christians, and the right-wing Jews, my gosh. And then, of course, the third one, people who don't know any better, and they'll just follow the crowd. And so they jump on the bandwagon, and they show the fear of Islam. They are out to, they hate our way of life. How many of you haven't heard that? These three people here. Nothing we can do can change it. You hate us. You will kill us. What choice do we have but to either roll over and die or kill whoever even shows his face to us as a preemptive measure to survive? So the politicians have crafted it in a near genocidal position. They hate the way we live. They hate us for who we are. There's no negotiating that one. And I'll come back to the other elements of this hate creation in a few minutes. The biggest demon here, that is the least recognized demon in the hate industry, in the fear industry, is the defense industry. Most people don't even think about it, and we don't. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'll bet you my year's salary, and as a real estate agent these days, that is not much. I'll bet you my year's income that behind all these hate mongers and these fear mongers and these experts on terrorism and experts on Islam and all that, I guarantee you they're getting dollars, big dollars, from various members of the defense production industry. Think about it. In the last 9 years, the fear industry has been the most lucrative industry. In the last 9 years, they have spun off more money, probably, than in most of the 20th century, I would say. Trillions of dollars. In the art of blowing people up, in the art of protecting people, in the art of all these things. Trillions of dollars. Millions, literally, millions of people have been killed in this slaughter thing. In the sanctions of Iraq alone, in 10 years, almost 1 million people had been killed. And who's even counting the people in Iraq and Afghanistan? Because the Defense Department said at one time, they were giving daily statistics. And then they thought, hello, wait a minute, this is not sounding so right. So they said, we will stop giving any statistics, we will stop taking statistics on the dead. And immediately the so-called government of Iraq said, oh yeah, we'll do the same. And it stopped taking numbers. But it would not be a flight of fantasy to say that the people killed in Iraq and Afghanistan have exceeded 1 million by now. They're being killed at a rate we don't even dare to imagine. There is enough depleted uranium in carpeting Iraq and Afghanistan to probably cover the whole country. And depleted uranium's half-life is 4.5 billion years. And it doesn't hurt you. You can eat it and pass it out without a problem. But when you breathe it, it sits in the lungs and it constantly doses the blood flowing through there and eventually causes genetic malformations, as is happening in Iraq right now. The defense industry is the biggest culprit in the fear generation.